Can you tell me a little bit about Transnistria? I've been seeing that a lot in the news, and I thought I knew Europe pretty well, but I never heard of Transnistria until you mentioned it.
Okay, yeah, it's a strip of land in northern that borders Ukraine and northern Moldova, and it is, the people there are basically Russians. I don't really know how it happened, but there was some. It broke away from Moldova, not entirely. It's still considered part of Moldova, but it is has a great degree of autonomy. Um, And I think the Russians have a military presence there, not a very large one. They have there's an old Soviet arms depot there. It's huge. It has it's maybe the largest one from the remaining from the Soviet era. And most of those weapons aren't all that useful, and the ammunition there is not all that useful, but it potentially could be, still any kind of weapon, even if it's not top notch, can serve a purpose in a war. So at various times there have been fears that the Ukrainians might actually try to attack Transnistria and take that depot. And a lot of people have speculated that the Russians are aware of this possibility and have wired the place to explode if that happens. And so, rather than let the Ukrainians get their hands on it, they might just blow it up. But yeah, there are quite a few people there, and they've been hit badly by this recent gas cutoff. Apparently it's just like basically all their industry had to just stop working on January 1st, came to a halt. So they're in a real crisis. Now, they're a pretty good distance from the Russians. Transnistria is not that far from Odessa. It's to, the west of Odessa. But if the Russians ever do, and I think they probably will, cross the Dnieper and march on Odessa, I think they'll go all the way to Transnistria. And so that eventually Transnistria will have, a direct border. It would be, for all intents and purposes, a part of Russia again. But that may be, who knows, a year or 2 years, 3 years in the future. In the meantime, there's a real open question about how it's going to survive. Moldova overall is in a real fix, but Transnistria in particular, because the current government is very, very hostile towards Transnistria, and they generally if they can make life harder for them, they do it. And the recent elections, they actually they actively suppressed votes from Transnistria as they did for Moldovans living in Russia, and there are many, many Moldovans that live in Russia, but they made it very, very difficult for them to vote in both Transnistria and in Russia. So again, they kind of regard those places as hostile territory. They do
Is
regard
it,
them as hostile territory.
could it be a potential flashpoint then, do you think? I mean, you said
Yeah,
there's that
potentially it
depot and
could.
there's a,
Yeah, no. I think it's something that there have been, again, occasionally there are rumors. There will be a flurry of rumors that the Ukrainians are preparing something, like they may, they're going to make a move on Transnistria. And if they did, they might do it with Moldovan support, with the Moldovans coming from the other side. I think there's always the risk. There's, you can see, I mean, it's just the Ukrainians are desperate, and they'll do anything that could maybe expand the war, and that's a possibility. That would be a way to expand the war. The Russians might feel that they have to intervene, but then they can say, "Hey, the Russians have now invaded Moldova." Who knows?
well, it'd be Ukraine that would have invaded
Yeah,
Moldova, right?
but I mean, it would be Ukraine first, but that never bothers anybody.
Is,
Just like you can say it was Ukraine that maybe started the war in eastern Ukraine. It was their effort to, um, to take those provinces by military force that began the war back in 2014. But of course, that's never how it's explained. It would be the same thing with Moldova if the Russians intervened after Ukrainian incursion or something, it would be blamed entirely on the Russians, and it could be used as a justification again for bringing more NATO, bringing NATO forces into direct conflict with Russia. That's the potential, but it may be, who knows, and who knows what's going on behind the scenes. Again, it just may be that. The Ukrainians might want to do that, but NATO might not want that to happen. Again, it seems clear to me that actually NATO, the U.S. in particular, is not eager to have a direct conflict with Russia.
Is Moldova part of the EU or NATO?
No, it's not part of the EU, and I don't think it's part of NATO either. In the recent election, there was actually some kind of referendum on joining the EU, and it won just barely. But and it won because actually within Moldova itself, it lost. But it won because of a great number of votes that came in from Western Europe. Moldovans that are living and working in Western Europe. Now, if that had been counterbalanced by the many, many Moldovans that live in Russia, I think almost certainly it would have lost. But there was just, blatant voter suppression in Russia. So, yeah, they haven't become part of the EU yet, but that's the clearly stated goal of the current government.
How can the Moldovans suppress votes in Russia? Like, can't the Russians help them set up voting booths, or
no.
I guess that would be election interference?
Yeah, right. They can't. Yeah, what happened is that there are a lot of Moldovans in Russia, and they're spread throughout Russia. They simply allowed, a voting center. They opened up a voting station in the embassy in Moscow, and that was it. And it was just, whereas I can't remember the number, but we're talking about many, many, many dozens in Western Europe. So, it was very blatant. It wasn't like, there's just a few more in Western Europe. No, it was, it was clearly an effort to minimize votes coming from Russia and to amplify votes coming from Western Europe.